Lieutenant James Chen stood at his post in Earth Station Alpha's diplomatic reception hall, trying not to stare at the approaching Merixi delegation. Even after 5 years of interstellar relations, the sight of 8-foot-tall aliens with their iridescent purple skin still amazed him. But today was different. Among the towering figures, a much smaller form caught his attention. At first, he thought it might be a child, but the formal diplomatic robes and confident stride suggested otherwise. The small alien barely reached 4 feet in height, yet she carried herself with unmistakable dignity. "That's their new junior diplomat," whispered Sarah, his fellow security officer. "Apparently, she's some kind of genetic throwback." The Merixi are pretty embarrassed about it. James frowned. The small diplomat's movements were precise and graceful as she followed the delegation's lead negotiator. While the other Merixi took long, sweeping steps, she moved with quick, efficient ones to keep pace. The station's artificial gravity shifted slightly, a common occurrence during maintenance cycles. While the tall Merixi ambassadors swayed uncertainly, the small diplomat adjusted instantly, even reaching out to steady one of her colleagues. "Her name is Valora," Sarah continued, checking her datapad. "First time they've sent someone like her for diplomatic duties. Usually, they keep their different ones away from public view." James watched as Valera organized the delegation's documents, her small fingers moving swiftly across the holographic displays. She seemed to anticipate her superior's needs before they arose, stepping forward with relevant information precisely when needed. The meeting proceeded smoothly until a technical issue arose with the translation system. The tall Merixi looked confused as their universal translators began producing gibberish. Before the human tech team could respond, Valera was already at the main console, her small size allowing her to slip easily between the crowded delegates. "The quantum matrix is misaligned," she explained in perfect English, surprising everyone. "It happens sometimes with the newer models. May I?" The human technician nodded, and Valera's fingers danced across the controls. Within moments, the system was functioning again. "You speak English?" James found himself asking before he could stop himself. Valera turned, and for the first time, he saw her eyes, a swirling mix of silver and violet. "I studied Earth languages directly," she said. "Universal translators are convenient, but they miss cultural nuances. In my position, accuracy is essential." A tall Merixi diplomat cleared his throat loudly. "Valera, remember your place." James saw something flicker across her face, a brief shadow of hurt quickly masked by professional composure. She bowed slightly and stepped back, almost disappearing behind the larger delegates. As the meeting continued, James noticed how the other Merixi seemed to look through Valera rather than at her. Yet she remained focused and efficient, handling complex diplomatic protocols with ease. When refreshments were served, she quietly ensured everyone had the correct dishes for their biological needs, though no one offered her any thanks. Near the end of the session, James overheard 2 Merixi delegates speaking in low voices. "Sending her was a mistake," one said. "What will other species think of us?" "It was Chief Diplomat Zorak's idea," replied the other. "Claimed her memory and processing speed make up for her deficiency." James watched Valera's shoulders tense slightly. She had heard them too. Yet she continued her work, her movements never faltering. As the delegation prepared to leave, Valera was the last in line. James noticed she carried not only her own documents, but also the materials other delegates had carelessly left behind. "Thank you for your help with the translator," he said as she passed his post. She paused, surprised by the acknowledgement. "Just doing my duty, Lieutenant Chen. Sometimes the smallest gears keep the biggest machines running," he offered with a smile. Valera's eyes widened slightly, and for a moment, her professional mask slipped, revealing a genuine smile. Then, with a small nod, she hurried to catch up with her delegation, her short legs moving quickly but gracefully across the polished floor. James watched her go, thinking that perhaps the Myrixi had accidentally sent their most interesting diplomat yet. 3 days after the Myrixi delegation's arrival, Earth Station Alpha's emergency alarms blared to life. Red lights flashed through the corridors as Lieutenant James Chen raced toward the Environmental Control Center. "Status report," he shouted as he entered the command room. "Cooling system failure in the diplomatic quarter," responded the chief engineer. "Temperatures rising fast, and we've got dignitaries from 15 species in there. Some of them can't handle heat well." The maintenance access was blocked by fallen debris from a recent micrometeorite impact. The repair robots were too large to squeeze through the gap, and most humans wouldn't fit either. Then James spotted Valera standing quietly in the corner, already studying the station's schematics on her datapad. "I can reach the controls," she said simply. "The access tunnel is small, but I can fit." The chief engineer shook his head. "We can't risk a diplomatic incident by endangering a Myrixi representative." "With respect," Valera replied firmly. "Several species in that quarter will suffer severe health issues if the temperature continues to rise. I'm volunteering." Before anyone could argue further, she was already removing her formal outer robe, revealing a practical bodysuit underneath. James noticed how the other Myrixi diplomats present looked away, embarrassed by their smaller companions' actions. "I'll guide you through the communication system," James offered, grabbing a headset. He caught her grateful glance as she headed for the access point. Through the security cameras, they watched Valera easily slip through the narrow opening. Her small size, which had earned her so much discrimination, was now proving invaluable. "The passage splits ahead," James directed through the headset. "Take the left tunnel." "Understood," Valera replied, her breathing steady despite crawling through the tight space. "The temperature's quite high here." As she navigated the maintenance tunnels, James kept talking, both to guide her and to distract her from the increasing heat. "You studied Earth languages directly. That's impressive." "When you're different," she answered, pausing to check her direction, "you learn to work twice as hard to be considered half as worthy." "That sounds like a heavy burden to carry." There was a moment of silence broken only by her movement through the tunnel. "Sometimes," she finally admitted, "the weight of others' expectations is heavier than any physical load." She reached the control panel, but the electronic access was damaged. Valera would need to manually override it. "The panel's internal mechanism is made for larger hands," she observed, a trace of familiar frustration in her voice. "Size isn't everything," James encouraged. "You've got steady hands and a sharp mind. That counts for more." Valera took a deep breath and began working. Her small fingers moved precisely, finding ways to manipulate controls designed for beings twice her size. After several tense minutes, the station's environment systems hummed back to life. "Cooling systems restored," announced the chief engineer, temperatures dropping to normal levels. When Valera emerged from the access tunnel, covered in dirt but successful, James noticed how the other Myrixi diplomats seemed unsure how to react. Their prejudices warred with the fact that her deficiency had just saved the day. "Well done," James said, offering her a clean towel. "You showed real courage in there." Lieutenant Chen, one of the senior Myrixi diplomats, interrupted. "We will handle our own staff members' debriefing." But before they could whisk her away, Valera turned to James. "Thank you for your guidance, Lieutenant. It was comforting to have someone who saw solutions instead of limitations." As she was led away by her colleagues, James watched her go, noticing how she walked a little taller despite her small stature. Perhaps she had proven something to herself today, even if others weren't ready to see it. Later, reviewing the incident report, James added a personal note. "Station safety protocols should be updated to recognize that different builds and sizes can be advantageous in emergency situations." He smiled, thinking of Valera's determined expression as she volunteered for the task. Sometimes the biggest changes started with the smallest steps. A week after the cooling system incident, Lieutenant James Chen found himself assigned to the Joint Human-Myrixi Cultural Exchange Project. He wasn't surprised to see Valera there, efficiently organizing data on her holographic display. What did surprise him was finding her alone in the project room, long after the other diplomats had left for the day. "You're here late," he said, entering with his evening security report. Valera looked up, her silver-violet eyes reflecting the soft station lights. "I prefer working when it's quiet. Less staring." James pulled up a chair, careful to choose one that wouldn't make her feel even smaller. "I've been wondering about something. You handle our gravity better than the other Myrixi. They always seem a bit uncomfortable." A small smile crossed her face. "You're more observant than most, Lieutenant." She paused, then added, "It's because I'm half graviton." Graviton, a species from a high-gravity world. My mother fell in love with a Myrixi diplomat during a trade mission. Valera's fingers traced patterns on her desk. Such relationships are discouraged. The Myrixi value their height as a sign of superiority. My mother's people are all shorter, adapted to their heavy world. James leaned forward, genuinely interested. "That explains your natural grace in our gravity." "Yes. While pure Myrixi struggle with Earth normal gravity, I find it comfortable. But being comfortable isn't always an advantage, especially when your society values different things." Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of senior diplomat Zarkax, who frowned at their informal interaction. "Valera, why aren't these reports completed?" he demanded, ignoring James completely. "They are completed, sir," she replied quietly. "I was just doing an extra review for accuracy." "Extra review won't change your limitations. Just finish the basic work you're assigned." With that, he swept out, his tall frame nearly brushing the ceiling. James watched Valera's shoulders slump slightly. "You know," he said carefully, "on Earth, we have a saying. Judge someone not by how high they can reach, but by how many they help up." Valera's eyes met his. "Your people truly believe that." "We've learned it the hard way. Humanity spent too long judging people by the wrong measures." He gestured at the cultural exchange data on her screen. "That's why projects like this matter. They help us see beyond our prejudices." Valera began sharing her screen, showing him the work she'd been doing. "I've been studying Earth's history of civil rights movements. It's inspiring. Your people fought to be judged by their character rather than their appearance." As they reviewed the data together, James noticed how Valera's natural diplomatic skills shone through. She could explain complex cultural concepts in simple terms, making connections that others missed. "You see patterns that others don't," he observed. "When you live between worlds," she replied, "you learn to see things from different angles. Being small means I often have to look up at others, but it also means I notice details they overlook." Their work continued into the evening, with Valera sharing insights about both Myrixi and Graviton culture. James found himself fascinated by her unique perspective. "Your mixed heritage isn't a weakness," he said as they finished up. "It's a bridge between worlds. We need more bridges out here in space." Valera gathered her materials, a thoughtful expression on her face. "Perhaps, but bridges often bear heavy burdens. They also connect people who might never meet otherwise," James pointed out. As they left the project room, Valera paused. "Lieutenant, thank you for seeing me as I am, not as what others think I should be." "James," he corrected gently. "When we're not on official duty, you can call me James." Her smile, though small, lit up her entire face. "Thank you, James." Walking back to his quarters later, James reflected that sometimes the biggest changes in the universe started with the smallest conversations. 2 days after the gala, Valera sat alone in her small office, staring at her computer screen with growing horror. Her hands trembled as she read through the encrypted messages she'd accidentally accessed while organizing diplomatic files. A knock at her door made her jump. "Come in," she called, quickly minimizing the screen. James entered, carrying 2 cups of Earth coffee, a drink they'd started sharing during their cultural exchange meetings. He stopped when he saw her face. "What's wrong?" Valera glanced at the security camera in the corner, then wrote quickly on her datapad, "Not safe to talk here." James understood immediately. The observation deck is quiet this time of day. Would you like to take a break? Once they reached the observation deck, with its view of Earth below and stars above, Valera finally spoke in a whisper. "I found something in the diplomatic files. Something terrible." "Tell me," James said softly, positioning himself to block any view of their conversation. "There's a faction in the Merixi government pushing for war with Earth." Her voice shook. "They've been sabotaging peace talks, manipulating data, making it look like humans are preparing to attack us first." James felt his stomach tighten. "Are you sure?" Valera nodded. "My size, it makes people forget I'm there. They leave terminals open, speak freely. I've been gathering pieces for weeks without realizing what they meant. But today, I found proof. We need to report this." "To whom?" Valera's eyes filled with tears. "The senior diplomats are part of it. And who would believe me? I'm just the small one, the mistake, the half-breed they barely tolerate." James reached for her hand, then stopped himself, remembering they were in public. "You're the only one who could have found this. Your unique position makes me uniquely helpless." She took a deep breath, calming herself. "I'm sorry, but you don't understand. In Merixi society, physical stature equals authority. Even with proof, they won't listen to someone my size. Then we'll make them listen." James's voice was firm. "Earth has protocols for whistleblowers, ways to protect those who expose wrongdoing. If I speak out, best case, they'll send me back to the Merixi homeworld in disgrace. Worst case," she shuddered. A group of tall Merixi diplomats entered the observation deck. Valera quickly stepped away from James, pretending to study Earth below. "Valera," called one of the diplomats, "you're needed to organize the files for tomorrow's security meeting." "Yes, senior diplomat," she replied, her face carefully blank. As she turned to leave, James caught her eye. "Sometimes," he said quietly, "the biggest courage comes in the smallest packages." That evening, James sat in his quarters, reviewing security protocols. His door chimed. Valera stood outside, clutching her datapad. "I made a copy of everything I found." Her voice was steady, despite her obvious fear. "But I need help to use it properly. I can't let them start a war, no matter what happens to me." James ushered her inside. "We'll figure this out together. You're not alone. They'll say I'm lying, that I manufactured the evidence because I'm bitter about my treatment. Then we'll find a way to prove it's real." James pulled up his security clearance on his computer. "Between your diplomatic access and my security codes, we can verify the data through independent channels." Valera watched him work, her small frame tense with worry. "Why are you helping me? This could ruin your career too." James looked at her seriously. "Because you're right, and because you're brave enough to stand up for what's right despite your fear." He smiled slightly. "And because I've learned that the size of someone's heart matters more than their height." Valera straightened her shoulders, determination replacing fear in her eyes. "Then let's save both our worlds, shall we?" Together, they began planning how to expose the truth. 2 small figures working to prevent a very big war. Over the next 3 days, Valera and James worked secretly to gather evidence. Her small size, once a source of shame, now became their greatest advantage. She could slip into places unnoticed, overhear conversations others missed, and access forgotten terminals in tight spaces. "Look at this," Valera whispered one evening in James's quarters. She showed him her datapad. "They're planning to sabotage tomorrow's peace conference. They've hidden weapons in the diplomatic gifts." James studied the security feeds she gathered. "We need to act now. The Earth-Merixi Alliance Treaty is being signed tomorrow. I've collected all the proof we need," Valera said, her voice stronger than he'd ever heard it. "But there's one problem. By Myrixi law, accusations must be presented in person before the High Council. They won't accept remote testimony." "That's too dangerous," James protested. "Once they realize what you know." "It's the only way." Valera stood up straight, all 4 feet of her radiating determination. "But I need your help." They spent hours planning. James used his security clearance to create a safe path to the council chamber. Valera memorized every detail of the evidence, knowing she'd only get one chance. The next morning, James watched through security cameras as Valera approached the council chamber. She wore her formal diplomatic robes, altered perfectly to her size. Despite being dwarfed by the massive doors, she walked with confidence. Inside, 12 tall Myrixi council members looked down from their high seats. Whispers filled the room as Valera stepped forward. "What is the meaning of this interruption?" demanded head councilor Vexnor. "And by one of your stature." Valera's voice rang clear. "I invoke the right of emergency testimony, as granted by Section 47 of Myrixi law." The councilors stirred uneasily. This ancient law couldn't be denied, even to someone of her size. "Very well," Vexnor growled. "Speak quickly." Valera activated her datapad, projecting images into the air. "I have evidence of treason against both the Myrixi Empire and Earth." For the next 20 minutes, she presented her case. Security footage, encrypted messages, and financial records appeared in the air around her. Her small hands moved gracefully, controlling the display with perfect precision. James watched through the cameras as the council members' expressions changed from dismissal to concern to alarm. Valera's voice never wavered, even when she named the conspirators, including some in that very room. Suddenly, one of the accused council members lunged for her, but Valera was ready. She ducked and rolled, something her larger kin could never have done so smoothly. James had already alerted security, and they burst in just as she evaded the attack. "Your size makes you a disgrace," the arrested councilor shouted as he was led away. Valera stood tall, her silver-violet eyes flashing. "My size let me see what you tried to hide. Your prejudice made you overlook me, and that was your mistake." The remaining council members huddled together, speaking in urgent whispers. Finally, head councilor Vexnor turned to Valera. "You have served the Empire well," he admitted grudgingly. Perhaps we have been too quick to judge worth by height alone." Valera bowed gracefully. "All I ask is that we stop this war before it begins, and that in the future we judge people by their actions, not their appearance." Later, as Earth security teams carefully removed the hidden weapons from the diplomatic gifts, James found Valera standing alone in the observation deck. "You did it," he said softly. She turned to him, tears shining in her eyes. "We did it. I couldn't have succeeded without you believing in me. You stood taller than any of them today." Valera smiled. "I finally realized that standing tall isn't about physical height. It's about standing up for what's right." Together, they watched Earth shine below them, knowing they'd helped preserve peace between their peoples, all because someone society had dismissed as too small had proven to have the biggest heart of all. A week after exposing the conspiracy, Valera faced her biggest challenge yet. The Myrixi High Council had called a special session to discuss the future of human-Myrixi relations. As the one who uncovered the plot, she would have to testify again, this time before hundreds of witnesses. James found her in their usual spot on the observation deck, staring at the stars. "Ready for tomorrow?" he asked. "No," she admitted. "The Great Hall. It's designed to make speakers look small. The podium alone is 6 feet tall." She laughed softly. "They probably never imagined someone my size would stand there." "Then we'll change their expectations again," James said. He pulled out his datapad. "I have an idea." They spent the evening planning. This time, Valera wasn't just going to speak, she was going to make history. The next morning, the Great Hall filled with diplomats from both worlds. The massive room, with its soaring ceiling and towering pillars, seemed designed to make Valera look even tinier than usual. James stood at his security post, watching Valera approach the giant podium. Whispers filled the hall. Some Myrixi diplomats smirked, expecting her to be barely visible behind it. But Valera didn't go behind the podium. Instead, she pressed a small button on her datapad. The holographic systems she and James had programmed the night before hummed to life. Suddenly, her image appeared in the air above the podium, life-sized and clear. She still stood at her natural height, but now everyone could see her perfectly. It was a simple solution, but one the height-obsessed Myrixi had never considered. Honored Council, her voice rang out. I stand before you not as a small person trying to be tall, but as myself, exactly as I am. The hall fell silent. Last week, we stopped a war by learning to look past physical differences, she continued. But preventing war isn't enough. We must build understanding. She gestured, and her hologram displayed images, tall Myrixi and shorter humans working together on the station. Different species dancing at the gala, James and herself solving the cooling system crisis. Our differences aren't weaknesses, they're opportunities. My mixed heritage lets me understand both our peoples. My size lets me go places others can't. Every person in this hall has unique gifts to offer. Some of the younger Myrixi were nodding. Even the older council members looked thoughtful. I propose a new diplomatic training program, Valera said. One that teaches all our peoples to value different perspectives. Because the universe is vast, and we need every viewpoint to understand it. Head Counselor Vex Nor stood. And you believe you could lead such a program, despite your stature. Valera's hologram smiled confidently. I believe I must lead it, because of my stature. Who better to teach acceptance than someone who has lived both sides? James watched proudly as Valera handled question after question. She was no longer the quiet diplomat hiding in corners. She had found her voice. Finally, the council called for a vote. As the results appeared on the great screens, Valera's hands trembled slightly, but her voice remained steady. Thank you for your trust, she said as the positive votes were confirmed. Together, we'll build bridges between all our peoples, no matter their size or shape. After the session, James found her in a quiet corridor. That was amazing, he said. Though I think some of the council were shocked when you chose to show yourself at your real height instead of making the hologram taller. Valera smiled. I spent too long wishing I was different. It's time everyone learned that great things can come in small packages. She reached for his hand, no longer caring who saw. Thank you for helping me find the courage to be myself. James squeezed her small hand gently. You always had the courage. You just needed to see it in yourself. Together, they walked to the observation deck, where Earth spun below and the stars stretched endlessly above. A universe full of differences waiting to be celebrated, not feared.